The page crumbled in her trembling hand as the gate agent's fingers curled around the charred edge, brandishing the burned passport like a cruel trophy in front of a jaw-dropped crowd. A hush swallowed the terminal. The hush that follows a blow you never expected. The woman's lips quivered, disbelief searing into her eyes, while the agent's smirk spoke volumes. Contempt, dismissiveness, power misused. Nobody realized then who she was or how far that one act would echo. Every life has a moment that changes its course forever. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this woman standing humiliated before a crowd of strangers? Who was she beyond the ashes of a destroyed passport? Why was she singled out, mocked, and ridiculed in a space where dignity should never have been questioned? The answer to these questions is not only about one traveler or one gate agent, but about power, who wields it, who abuses it, and who stands powerless until the truth is revealed. And this truth, hidden in plain sight, would ignite a scandal that stretched far beyond one airport terminal and shook the nation's aviation system to its very core. Why would a gate agent destroy a passenger's passport, a document sacred to travel, identity, and citizenship? What arrogance fuels such a decision? And what hidden authority did this young black woman really hold that no one in that crowded room could have imagined? Every question raised on that day would demand answers. What power did she really hold concealed beneath the quiet grace with which she endured her humiliation? Was she truly just another victim of cruelty? Or was she someone whose authority could level careers and dismantle systems? And if she was that powerful, how did the people who laughed, who mocked, and who looked away fail to see it? The story does not end with a smirk and a burned passport. It begins there. For justice does not sleep forever, and arrogance never escapes its day of reckoning. How then did justice finally catch up with them? How did a single act of humiliation in one corner of an airport unravel into an investigation that drew national headlines, corporate disgrace, and irreversible consequences for those who thought themselves untouchable? This is not simply the story of humiliation, it is the story of revelation, of authority hidden in plain sight, and of justice delivered in full. Long before that fateful day inside the airport terminal, the young black woman who now stood silent before a sneering gate agent lived a life of service that most of the crowd around her could never have imagined. She was the Chief FAA Inspector, a position that carried weight beyond titles, for she bore the responsibility of ensuring the skies above the nation remained safe for millions of travelers each year. Her days began before the sun, and often ended long after others had gone home, with endless inspections, meetings, and difficult decisions. Yet behind the uniform, there was a woman defined not by authority, but by quiet integrity. Those who knew her spoke of how she would pause her day to help an elderly couple struggling to find their gate, or how she would kneel beside a nervous child boarding a plane for the first time, reassuring them that flying was safe and that their journey would be watched over. She carried herself with the grace of someone who understood that true power is found not in how loudly you command, but in how gently you protect. Across from her stood the gate agent and the supervisor who enabled him, a pair whose arrogance was known in hushed conversations among staff and passengers alike. The gate agent, with his quick smirk and sharper tongue, had built a reputation not for efficiency, but for belittling travelers he believed beneath him. Rolling his eyes at minority passengers, mocking accents with a cruel precision meant to draw laughter, dismissing questions with a wave of his hand, these were not isolated incidents, but patterns repeated so often they blended into routine. And standing at his side was the supervisor, a man more dangerous not because he spoke loudly, but because he never spoke at all when discipline was needed. His silence was approval, his laughter was complicity, and his presence gave cover for cruelty to thrive unchecked. Co-workers whispered among themselves, words carried like warnings in the back offices. One day, this is going to go too far. That warning lingered like a shadow, because deep down even they knew arrogance unrestrained has a breaking point. They just never expected it would come so swiftly, or in front of so many witnesses. This clash of character, her quiet strength against their loud arrogance, set the stage for the humiliation that would soon unfold. The young black woman who had spent her life ensuring safety in the skies was now standing in line as just another passenger, stripped of her title, her authority invisible to those around her. And those who thrived on mocking and dismissing others saw her not as the guardian of aviation, but as an easy target. This imbalanced dignity against derision, patience against cruelty was not just about one confrontation. It was about the broader question of what happens when arrogance collides with integrity, when cruelty mistakes silence for weakness, and when the powerful forget that titles can be hidden but authority never disappears. That contrast, so sharp and so undeniable, was what turned an ordinary flight into an extraordinary moment that would soon echo far beyond the walls of one terminal. The day had begun like any other for most passengers in the terminal, but for the young black woman, the Chief FAA Inspector traveling without fanfare, it was meant to be just another quiet flight. She approached the gate like everyone else, holding her passport firmly in hand, her steps steady but humble, drawing no attention to herself. The line inched forward until her turn came. She placed her passport on the counter, expecting the ordinary ritual of a glance, a scan, and a boarding pass in return. But the ordinary would not greet her that day. Instead, the gate agent lifted the passport between his fingers, narrowed his eyes, and with a sneer that sliced through the air, delivered words designed not to question but to humiliate. "This doesn't look real. Where'd you get this, honey?" His tone was not curious, it was contemptuous, dripping with condescension, meant to provoke laughter rather than resolve a question. And in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers in line began to shift uncomfortably. Some lowered their heads, unwilling to get involved, while others stared wide-eyed, caught between disbelief and fear of what might follow. The young black woman remained calm, her hands steady, her voice measured, but the humiliation had already begun to unfold. The agent smirked, holding her passport higher, turning it slightly as though presenting it for ridicule. A few soft chuckles broke the silence, the kind of cruel laughter that feeds arrogance and leaves dignity hanging by a thread. And then came the supervisor, stepping forward with the ease of someone used to watching and enabling, his lips curling into a laugh that echoed across the gate. Instead of discipline, he offered validation. Instead of protection, he joined the performance. Together, they mocked what they should have respected, forgetting the eyes of the passengers, forgetting the cameras now being raised silently to record what would not remain hidden for long. And then, in a moment that seemed both reckless and deliberate, the line between humiliation and destruction was crossed. With a swift motion, the gate agent snatched the passport from her hands. Gasps rippled through the waiting crowd as he held it up like an object of disdain rather than the sacred document it was. His fingers dug into his pocket, and before anyone could intervene, the flicker of a lighter illuminated the corner of the booklet. The crackle of flames broke the silence, sharp and merciless, as the edges curled and blackened. The young black woman's voice rose, trembling but firm, words carrying both plea and command. "Please don't do this." But the plea fell against arrogance too deep to listen, drowned out by the hiss of burning paper. Passengers stood frozen, some covering their mouths in horror, others holding their phones high, capturing every second of an act that would soon ignite not just paper, but a scandal. As the flames consumed the passport, the smirk on the agent's face widened, and the supervisor's laugh rang out, a cruel chorus to the crime unfolding. The terminal had become a stage, the victim their unwilling centerpiece, and humiliation their chosen weapon. But what the crowd did not know, what the gate agent and supervisor themselves could not have imagined, was that this was not just a moment of public humiliation. This was not merely arrogance put on display. This was career suicide for them. For the woman whose dignity they mocked held in her silence a power far greater than their laughter could ever command. And when the flames died, it would be their futures reduced to ashes, not hers. The terminal erupted the moment the last ember flickered out. Passengers who had stood frozen only seconds before now surged forward with voices raised, demanding answers, demanding action. Some cried out in anger, others in disbelief, and more than a few turned their phones toward the gate agent and supervisor, recording every angle, every smirk, every fragment of ash still clinging to the air. Security stepped in, rushing to create order from chaos. But the young black woman, the Chief FAA Inspector, though none yet knew it, remained still, her composure unbroken. Her silence in that storm of outrage was not weakness. It was power disguised as restraint. While others shouted, she stood calm, her eyes fixed, her posture steady, as if she already knew the weight of what had just happened would not vanish into the crowd. In her quiet control, she built suspense not only for those watching in that moment, but for an entire nation soon to see. It did not take long for the fire of outrage to leap beyond the walls of the airport. By evening, the first headlines appeared, their words as sharp as the flames that had licked the edges of her passport. Passenger claims gate agent destroyed passport. Another followed swiftly. Racial profiling allegations rock major airline. Images captured on cell phones began to circulate online, shared from one device to another, until what was once a single confrontation had become a story carried into homes, offices, and communities across the country. The airline moved quickly into damage control mode, executives issuing carefully crafted statements, promising internal reviews, speaking of company values and customer respect. But behind their polished words was panic, for they knew what had been caught on camera was not only undeniable, it was unforgivable. And somewhere in those offices, one question lingered in hushed meetings. Who exactly was this woman, whose humiliation now threatened their empire? As the investigation began, the scene shifted into a relentless montage of voices and claims. Witnesses lined up to tell their stories, some describing the moment with anger, others with shame for not stepping in sooner. Airline staff were interviewed, their accounts painted with hesitation, careful not to condemn too strongly, nor excuse too blatantly. At the same time, the FAA, silent and watchful, began to gather its own evidence. Unknown to the public, officials who answered directly to the Chief FAA Inspector herself were already observing, already piecing together what the public had not yet understood. The company's executives, in their polished suits, sought to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, an error in judgment, a singular act not reflective of the whole. But the weight of evidence mounted, each recording, each testimony, stripping away the defense they hoped to build. And yet, as with all great scandals, doubt crept into the narrative. Rumors surfaced, whispered in online forums and repeated in careless conversations. Some claimed the woman had faked her ID, others suggested she had overreacted, that the flames had not been as deliberate as they seemed. These red herrings spread quickly, muddying the waters, tempting the public to question the story they had seen with their own eyes. Was she who she said she was? Had the confrontation been exaggerated? Such questions lingered, not because the truth was absent, but because arrogance, when cornered, always seeks escape through confusion. But while the world doubted, she remained silent, her true identity concealed, her dignity intact. That silence became the greatest suspense of all. For when the truth finally emerged, it would not only silence the rumors, it would bring the downfall of everyone who had dared to mock her name. For weeks, silence was her greatest weapon. While the airline scrambled to contain the fallout, while the media churned through rumor after rumor, and while passengers who had witnessed the flames were dragged through endless interviews, she said nothing. Not a single public statement, not even the faintest confirmation of who she truly was. That silence, though, was not avoidance. It was preparation. Every headline that doubted her, every executive that whispered behind closed doors, every rumor questioning her identity only fed the storm she was carefully waiting to unleash. And when the day came, the world was not ready. The cameras were already flashing when she entered the room. A sea of reporters filled the press conference hall, their notebooks open, their microphones pointed forward, eager for yet another fragment of scandal to fuel their next broadcast. Airline executives had been whispering to each other just minutes before, convinced the pressure had finally forced her into the open, certain that they would find some way to turn the moment in their favor. But what they did not realize was that they were walking directly into the collapse of their own defense. She stepped forward, steady, calm, her eyes meeting the cameras with a quiet authority that required no theatrics. And then, as if the air itself had been holding its breath, she reached into her bag and produced the object that ended all doubt. In her hand gleamed the unmistakable badge. The seal of the Federal Aviation Administration caught the light, its weight undeniable, its authority absolute. And then came the words that cut through every lie, every rumor, every carefully crafted excuse the airline had tried to put forward. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the Chief FAA Inspector, the person with authority over every gate, every airline, and every employee in that terminal. The silence that followed was deafening. Reporters, mid-scribble, froze. Executives who had come armed with talking points collapsed into stunned silence. And passengers who had doubted her sat back in disbelief, realizing that the woman humiliated at the gate was the very person who had the power to determine their fate in the skies. The press conference erupted only seconds later, questions hurled from every direction, cameras clicking like thunder, voices overlapping in desperation to capture the first quote, the first reaction. But for the executives who had laughed, for the gate agent who had sneered, for the supervisor who had joined in mockery, there was no laughter left. They had not only insulted a traveler, they had humiliated the highest authority in aviation oversight, the single figure whose judgment carried the weight of federal law. And in that moment, the balance of power flipped. The hunter had become the hunted, and the very system they thought protected them now turned its full force against them. From that moment forward, the question was no longer whether justice would come but how devastating its arrival would be. Once the truth was undeniable, the wheels of justice began to turn with precision. No one who played a role in that moment at the gate would walk away untouched. The gate agent, the very man who had sneered as he set fire to her passport, found his career reduced to ashes just like the document he destroyed. Within days, he was fired without appeal. The license that once gave him authority to handle passengers' travel was revoked permanently. His name was blacklisted across every major carrier in the United States. Never again would he stand behind a counter representing the face of aviation. He had turned a lighter on a passport, and in return, the system turned a spotlight on him, and it burned hotter than he could ever endure. The supervisor who had laughed along, emboldening the arrogance of the moment, faced a slower, but no less devastating fall. His title was stripped, his role reduced, and before the cameras he was forced into a public apology. But apologies could not rebuild the fragments of a reputation shattered in front of millions. The humiliation of standing before the press, admitting his part in the cruelty, left a stain that no retraining program could ever erase. He remained, but in name only. His career had collapsed into a cautionary tale, his future sealed as an example of how complicity can destroy a man as surely as direct guilt. The airline executives who had spent weeks scrambling to contain the firestorm now found themselves under federal scrutiny. Meetings behind closed doors gave way to subpoenas. Polished statements dissolved into depositions. The fines leveled against them cut deep, but the damage to their reputation was even deeper. Headlines screamed across the nation, FAA inspector humiliated by airline staff, justice served. Passengers who had once trusted the brand turned their backs in outrage. Social media erupted with calls for boycotts, hashtags trending for weeks as viral footage of the burning passports circled the globe. Stock prices dipped as investors questioned how an empire built on travel could survive such a reckless public wound. One by one, those who had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated her faced consequences, tailored to the weight of their insults. For the gate agent, exile from the industry. For the supervisor, a public collapse of pride. For the executives, financial pain and reputational ruin. Each punishment echoed the harm they inflicted, a mirror held up by justice itself. And all the while she remained steady, her integrity intact. Her silence transformed into a statement louder than any accusation. The message was clear. In the world of aviation, arrogance would not fly unchecked, and cruelty would not be left unanswered. As passengers across the country watched the footage replay again and again, as late-night hosts dissected the scandal, and as everyday travelers shared their own stories of humiliation at airline counters, a shift occurred. This was no longer just about a burned passport. It became about power, about dignity, about accountability in an industry too often shielded from scrutiny. And at the center of it stood the Chief FAA Inspector, the woman who had been treated as invisible until her authority became inescapable. Justice had not only been served, it had been broadcast to the world. In the days that followed, the chaos of the terminal seemed like a distant memory. The passengers who had watched in silence that morning would never forget the sight of her passport turning to ash, nor the sound of her calm but broken plea, "Please, don't do this." Yet while others replayed that moment as a symbol of humiliation, she carried herself with a calm strength. Weeks later, cameras captured her boarding another flight, her presence now unmistakable. Flight attendants straightened as she walked down the aisle. Pilots nodded in quiet respect. She was no longer the anonymous traveler at the mercy of a cruel gate agent. She was, and always had been, the Chief FAA Inspector, the authority that watched over every departure, every landing, every mile of American skies. While her dignity soared higher than ever, those who once mocked her stood in ruins. The gate agent who had sneered with arrogance now stood jobless, his name whispered in shame across the industry. The supervisor who had laughed beside him lived under the shadow of his own apology, his career demoted to irrelevance. The executives who once dismissed complaints as routine paperwork now faced an unshakable stain on their brand. And though their downfall was public and merciless, hers was quiet, composed, and resolute. She did not need vengeance. She simply needed to walk forward. And in doing so, she proved that arrogance may burn itself to ashes, but dignity cannot be destroyed. Her story is not only about humiliation and justice. It is about the silence that speaks louder than anger, the strength that endures long after cruelty has passed. It is about the reminder that in a world quick to judge and dismiss, integrity remains unshaken. The gate agent's lighter burned a passport, but it could not scorch character. The supervisor's laughter echoed in a terminal, but it could not silence truth. And the executives' scramble to protect profit could not shield them from accountability. In the end, all that remained was the undeniable weight of justice and the unbroken dignity of one woman who refused to be reduced by another's arrogance. Arrogance burns itself to ashes, but dignity cannot be destroyed. What would you have done if you witnessed this? Would you have spoken up or stayed silent? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. And if you think this was shocking, wait until you hear about the billionaire who tested his maid by leaving the safe wide open. What happened next left him speechless.